Well, thank you very much. I really feel overwhelmed with this combination of Greek and Southern hospitality. I never expected so many people to appear today on a Saturday, a lovely day like this. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for Father Paul for initiating this development, and also to Victor here. We've been communicating for some time now. So I feel very privileged to be here today. I was very impressed last night when we came from the airport straight into the service for the Heredismi. And I was so happy to hear the familiar Byzantine tones, and very impressed with the kind of church you have here, and also following the tradition so closely. You don't hear?
No, we don't. They don't. And this needs a little bit. Yeah, a little tape.
This is about the best I can do.
That's good. That's perfect.
I can
Yeah,
hold
take
it.
it off. You want to do that? That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, that would be easier.
It's good. It's better for photography that way too.
Well, let's see.
Okay.
Do you hear me now? Oh, okay. All right. Do you like to hear stories?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So maybe I will start with a story. But before I do that, I'd like to finish what I was saying about the service last night. Coming here and listening to the same kind of chants that I knew in Cyprus and I heard anywhere I go during these times, it's very, very awesome in the sense that you can be in Hong Kong, go to a Greek Orthodox church, and hear the same sounds that you heard in Cyprus when you were growing up. This is one of the good parts of globalization, I guess. But anyway, so here is a story that I told in Budapest last year when I happened to be there. And they asked me to tell a short story about my work. So I was thinking, and then this story that I have in the river at the beginning came to my mind. And here how it goes. It said a pilgrim went to a hermit on Mount Athos and asked him, "Father, how can I save myself? How can I save my soul?" And the hermit said to him, "Do as I tell you, and then you'll find your salvation." "What can I do?" "For 1 month," he said, "every day at dusk, go to the cemetery and hurl insult to the dead. Tell them how bad they were, how sinful they were, that they will burn in hell forever, and just notice everything that happens around you. After a month, come and tell me what happened." So this pilgrim goes to the cemetery every day from 5 or 6 in the afternoon, insulting the dead, watching around to see any changes. So after a month, he goes back to the hermit and says, "Father, I've done what you told me, and I noticed around, but nothing happened." He said, "Go back to the cemetery for another month and praise the dead. Tell them how great they were, how wonderful human beings they were, the kind of achievements they attained, and notice everything that happens around you." Again, the hermit, the pilgrim goes back to the hermit after a month of doing that every afternoon. He said, "Father, I did what you told me, but nothing happened." And he said, "Well, my son, if you want to be saved, be like the dead, indifferent to curses and indifferent to praises." So that's a recipe for salvation. Speaking about hermits, I thought I can tell you a little bit before I discuss how I ended up becoming Orthodox again. As I was finishing up writing in the river, my wife said to me, "You must meet somebody," because a friend of mine told me that this individual has an extraordinary story to tell that has to do with his spiritual development. Well, I said, look, I have heard so many stories, I have enough, I don't want another one. But this is what Thalia told me, that I should really bring in contact with him. Anyway, as before, I listened to my wife, and believe me, had I not listened to her, I wouldn't be here today, because she was the one who pushed me to go on a trip to Mount Athos, where no woman can go. She called this individual, and first of all, the man was suspicious. Why would she call him? But then when she said who I was and I wanted to see him, he said, oh, I've read your husband's work, and I'll be happy to come and tell my story. What was his story? He came to the house a bit reluctant. He was a man around 50, a businessman. And he was doing some businesses in one of the former Soviet republics. He was telling us how he, when on a trip to this country, he was arrested and sent to jail of some false accusations that somehow he was trafficking in human beings. It was false. It was an attempt to extract ransom money for him. The whole system was corrupt, and some politicians with the police and the courts created a kind of a conspiracy to get people like him and ask for ransoms to get them out of the country. Well, he was going out of his mind, he said, and the conditions that they kept him was very bad. His wife in Cyprus was going out of her mind, and his mother. Finally, they found a lawyer who represented him there, and through the lawyer, they managed to smuggle into his cell 2 books. One was the New Testament, and the other was about the life of saints. He told me very sincerely that he was not interested in religion. He never read the Bible. He never read anything about the saints. And he was not allowed to read anything during his incarceration. But when the guards were not looking, he began reading these 2 books. And he was finding some kind of an encouragement, even though the conditions under which he lived was very, very cold, the food was not good, and he was in a desperate situation. One night, he said, as I was lying on my bed, which was very, very cold, here is this monk that appeared in front of me and introduced himself to him. I am Elder Paisios of the Holy Mountain. I said to him, have you ever heard of Elder Paisios? He said, never. I have never heard of him. But he said, and I said to him, did he open the door and came in? No, he said, he just appeared there. And was he in a physical form? He said, absolutely in a physical form, the way I see you right now. And what did he tell you? He said to me that not to worry, not to be afraid, and that he was going to help him get out of this situation. But he said, you have to promise me one thing. When you go back to Cyprus, I want you to go and meet a hermit Seraphim, who is going to be your spiritual guide. I said to him, have you ever heard of any elder Seraphim? Never, he said. I never had anything to do with the church. I would go to church only once or twice a year, just for Easter or Christmas. But I was not a practicing Christian. So when this vision, which he claimed it was not a vision, but an actual materialization of this guy there, of Elder Paisios, he kept visiting him periodically, and he got such an encouragement that he found peace within himself. In the meantime, he was reading, I said to him, perhaps when you are reading the books on the life of saints, did you read anything about Elder Paisios? No, he said, there was nothing.
He's a new saint.
Well,
He lived in northern Greece.
yes, he's considered as such. He's not being formally
Right.
declared a saint. But anyway, so the lawyer managed to get him out temporarily until his court case. And the lawyer said to him, look, do not appear at the court because there is no justice here. What I would advise you is just run out of the country if you can, but because you are not going to live alive from this place. So he managed to escape through the Russian border, eventually came back to Cyprus. And he was afraid that this mafia that was after him, demanding something like 40,000 euros to let him go, that was after him. So when my wife called him, he thought that it was some kind of a conspiracy to bring him back to this former republic. When Amy explained to him what she was interested, then he calmed down and came to the house. So I said to him, as he was describing these things, and he was so eager to make me accept that what he was saying was not just a fantasy, and he had no reason to say that. He came with a friend of his who was related to to Father Maximus. Well, I said, did you meet the hermit that Elder Baisios told you to meet? He said, yes. He found, in fact, that there was a hermit under a certain monastery in Cyprus. He went to meet him, and he was a 91-year-old man, which I called Father Seraphim, and he became his elder. He became his elder. I said to him, can I meet this elder? He said, sure. We'll make an arrangement and we'll go and meet him. So with a friend of mine and with my wife, we went to meet Father Seraphim. When he came to see us, here is this short guy, very thin and full of life. He was 91 years old. He lived by himself under the monastery, and he had his own garter. He was working every day, praying most of the time, and he told me his story. How did he become a hermit? And that's even a more interesting story. Father Seraphim was one of the founders of the Communist Party of Cyprus. When he was 15, he rebelled against what he considered as the injustices all around him. And he said the only people who were interested in the poor were the communists. So I joined them. And from the age of 15 until the age of 70, he was an active member of the Communist Party. His wife was a churchgoer. So on Sunday, he said, I would take my wife to church. I would go to the coffee shop, play cards, drink my coffee, play backgammon, and then at the end of the service, I would pick her up, and then we would walk home. And then he was trying to tell me, those communists were not bad people. They were really labor unionists, and they were advocating the amelioration of the problems of the poor. And the only ones who were looking for the welfare of the poor were the communists. So, and he developed those usual anti-clerical kind of way of seeing the world. He went to England for a period of time and ended up making some money owning fish and chips kind of restaurants. Eventually, he went back to Cyprus because he wanted his daughters to marry Cypriots. So he came back to Cyprus, and he bought a hotel in Limassol, and something happened in his life. He didn't tell me what it was. And it was a kind of he reached a kind of a state of despair. So he said, I fell on my knees, and I screamed, and I said, if there is a God, why don't you show me a sign and help me out in my problem? And he said, on that very instant, it was like the heavens opened up, and I saw God. And he said, from that moment, he said, I became a transformed human being. It was like Paul on the road to Damascus. He had that experience of Christ, and from a persecutor of Christians, he became the leading apostle to the Gentiles. So Father Seraphim, whose name was not Father Seraphim, of course, decided that he wanted to devote the rest of his life to pursue the knowledge of God. And his wife was delighted. Both of them decided that they were going to join monasteries. He was going to join a men's monastery. She was going to go to a women's monastery, now at the age of 70 now. So Father Seraphim went to one of the monasteries in Cyprus, and the monk said to them, "What do you think this is? A kind of a nursing home?" So poor Father Seraphim could not get entrance into a monastery because they thought that he was looking for, going to a nursing home. Why not to a monastery? He went to Mount Athos, and he was roaming around the mountain, and he met a hermit there. And the hermit, he told him his story. The hermit said to him, "Go back to the monastery." And he went to several other monasteries, and he got the same kind of rejection. So go to that monastery, and they will accept you there. So he goes back to the monastery that they told him this is not a nursing home. He goes into the Archondariki and then says to him, "I came here to stay, but you can't stay here." I said, "No, Father so-and-so from Mount Athos told me to come here, and you will accept me." So the elder of the monastery, a very venerated elder, who happened to be 4 years younger than him, we are talking about 70 years old now, he came down from his cell, and he had a conversation with him and realized that he was really genuine. His experience was authentic. And he gave him permission to stay as a dokimos at the monastery. In 2 years' time, he said, they made me a megaloschimos. They tonsured him, and he became a regular member of the monastery. And they appreciated his skills because he had a lot of skills running restaurants, and so he was very useful to the monastery. But the monastery was not good enough for Father Seraphim. He was a man in a hurry. He wanted to do a much more concentrated kind of prayer. So he got permission, and they turned a former stable for donkeys into a kind of a skiddy, and they built him a little chapel, and that's where he spent the rest of his time, and he became a spiritual guide to a lot of people, visitors who would go there for spiritual guidance. So from 9 in the morning until 11 in the morning, his skiddy is open for spiritual counseling. But he spends all his time, he said, praying. Most of the time. He sleeps very little. He works in his garden, and he showed us his garden with the vegetable. You are talking now about an old man of 92 years old, with full of energy, full clarity of mind, and he kept telling me and telling everybody who was there. And me privately, he said, "You can't imagine," he said, "how good God is, how loving God is, that everybody, God wants everybody to be saved," he said. And he kept mentioning how compassionate God was. You are talking about somebody that 20 years ago was a communist. And this experience transformed him. So I was very fascinated with this story because I've been studying mystical experiences and mystics throughout the ages. And his transformation was typical of many people who had similar experiences. As Father Maximus would say, the experience that Father Seraphim had was exactly the experience of Abraham, exactly the experience of Paul on the road to Damascus, because it's with the same God that they connected. And anybody who makes that connection cannot be the same human being. Sociologists have studied this kind of experiences, and the conclusion was that whoever has such an experience is so overwhelming that there is no other experience that can compete with it. All other relationships become insignificant compared with that contact. You make a contact with the Godhead, basically. And once you have that experience, you have this urge to spread the information or the gospel to everybody else. And that's exactly how I saw Elder Seraphim. Now, his story was very interesting because of his background. And we have a friend in Cyprus, a couple, who they are former communists. They were members of the Communist Party of the island, but the husband was expelled because he was for reform. He was a Democrat, and the party remained very Stalinist in many ways. So they expelled him from the party. He was a journalist and an author. He wrote books. And his wife was a very celebrated author of the island for children's books. So his wife was in Athens for some physical examinations. Some suspicions appeared on her lungs, nothing eventually. And we thought that we would take him to the beach. He was an 84-year-old man. As we were going to the beach, we started talking about life. And he said to me, I cannot ride anymore because I cannot see. And then he was lamenting about his condition. He said, all my life I've been writing, trying to give people encouragement about the future. But how can I tell them, how can I write now when the future for me is going to be death? He was so scared of his mortality. And he said, I am losing my senses, I'm losing my eyes, pretty soon I lose my... Once I lose my senses, he said, I will become nothing. So I felt very sorry for the man, and at first I thought, well, maybe I should remain silent. Then I said, but I have to confront him with his existential frustration and maybe help him out a little bit. And I said to him, I call him Vladimiros, I said, Vladimir, how do you know that you will be nothing after you die? And he said, what else is there? What makes you think, I said, that once you are dead, you will be zero? Because he said, when I am dead, he said, I will become zero. He had this nihilistic worldview that plunged him into a depression that his wife was asking us to help him out of that depression. Basically, his depression was a product of his worldview. And I was trying to help him perhaps see some light at the end of the tunnel. And if I was going to tell him about the conventional understanding of hell and damnation, he would have said, I've heard this before, I don't want to hear it again. Because his grandfather was a priest. And his parents were very much part of the church. So he rebelled against his parents. He went to Bulgaria and got his degree in philosophy from Bulgaria, and he internalized the worldview of Marxism and came back to the island with the label of the communist. Nobody was talking to him except the communist, so he became a communist bona fide. So on the way to the beach, we started talking about them, and I said to him, you know, I have changed my view because I think modern science is really leading us to the kind of conclusions that theologians have been saying all along throughout the ages. I don't know if you remember, the New York Times had an article a long time ago, Time magazine. He said, the changes in science are such today that the science is leading us back to God. And he said it was as if the scientists have been struggling to climb the mountain of knowledge, and when they reached the top, they found a bunch of theologians waiting for them. So having that in mind, I began engaging Vladimiros to the reasons why I am a believer. And I was not giving him answers from the Bible. I was giving him answers from science. And I said to him, look, for one thing, I said, if you look at all the great religions, whether it is Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, overall tribal religions, all of them concluded that there is more to life than this physical universe. You may have differences, but that's a general consensus. And of course, this is no proof, I said, that there is life after death. But I said, look at ancient philosophy, look at Plato. When Socrates was being sent to his death, he was telling his judges, you are going to live, I am going to die. Who is better off? Only God knows. And Plato posited life beyond the grave. So the great philosophers, with the exception of some contemporary philosophers, whether it was Nietzsche, Marx, Sartre, and Bernard Russell, most of the philosophers of the past accepted that this universe is not all there is. So start from that point. Then I said, at our disposal now, we have knowledge that comes from the near-death experience. You all know what that is, right? The near-death experience started with that people are dead, and yet they are not dead. They have experiences. And this is well documented, how people who were defined as clinically dead, they come back and they tell the doctors things that they were saying during the signing of the death certificate. They would say things that were happening in other parts of the hospital that they couldn't possibly know. So the near-death experience is a major breakthrough in the notion that perhaps there is something beyond the grave. And then I mentioned also with some researchers of computer scientists who claim, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, but I've been at a conference where they presented their research, that with computers, presumably they were able to make contact with the grave, with the dead, believe it or not. So I was trying to talk to him in a language that he could understand. And one of my favorite theologians, Orthodox theologians, was Philip Sherard. Does anybody know who Philip Sherard is? Okay. He was the collaborator of Gallistos Ware in translating the Philogalia. Philip Sherard fell in love with Greece because he was an officer during the Second World War. And then he began interested in Greek literature. He translated some of the poets of Greece. And eventually he got interested in Orthodoxy. He became Orthodox. He became a convert. And towards the end of his life, he bought a house at Evia, and he became some kind of a lay spiritual guide to the people there. He wrote a book that I found fascinating called the Christianity Lineaments of a Sacred Tradition. And there he has a discussion about life after death that I would recommend that you take a look at it. It's very, very fascinating. So what I was trying to do with our friend is to use logic to help him overcome his materialist reductionism that plunged him into this kind of horrendous depression. So then after we met with the hermit, I said, here are these two former communists. What about if I bring them together? So I suggested this to Vladimir. I said, I've met this former comrade of yours. Would you like to meet him? He's a hermit. Well, he said, why not? So we go with his wife and my wife, the four of us, plus the fellow who discovered him. We go there, he was waiting at the door. He spread his hands out, he said, comrade, welcome. So they went in, it was a very warm encounter, and these people together, they had so many things to talk about in terms of their involvement in the Communist Party. Now, I don't know what happened, whether my friend was influenced by that encounter, but before we left Cyprus, he said he was planning on going to visit him again. So these are some stories that of different people with different worldview, because I really think that our problem today is an outdated worldview that dominates our higher culture. And this is the worldview that I absorbed as after I arrived in America in the early 60s. When I came here to study business, I thought that I was going to get my degree, go back to Cyprus and make a living, get married, have children, and stay there. I was very happy living on the island. It's a lovely island. If you haven't visited it, I strongly recommend it before the developers take all the land and destroy it. And before, God forbid, the island is taken over completely by Turkey. But anyway, I was planning on going back, and I was challenged to my core in terms of what I was studying. When I look back, I am a product of the 60s. I know I'm an old man. And the 60s was my introduction into American society. And that was the time of the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam. I was a naive foreign student trying to survive financially and otherwise. So all of these things around me was something radically different from what I experienced growing up on the island. And this is what led me into sociology, by the way, because I thought that sociology was going to give me some answers. And how many of you have experienced extraordinary coincidences that change your life? All of us. So accidental encounters can lead us into a different direction in life. So I won't go into these details, but through accidents, I ended up going on to get a degree in sociology. By the time I got my doctoral degree, I became an agnostic. You know what an agnostic is? Somebody who sits on the fence. You don't know which way to go. I thought I had no choice. I had no choice but become an agnostic, because everything that I was exposed to in terms of my readings and in terms of my classes led to the conclusion that God is dead, the only reality is the physical universe, and so on. I was not a very happy agnostic, by the way. I thought I had no choice. I thought that if you wanted to be a real intellectual, you have to be tough-minded and not be seduced by all kinds of pie-in-the-sky promises of salvation and so on. So I thought I was one of those tough-minded intellectuals. Speaking about coincidences, but I'll come to that in a moment. When I look back in terms of what was the underlying worldview that I was absorbing that made me an agnostic, I came to the conclusion that it is what I would call the syndrome of modernity. A syndrome of modernity characterized of four factors, of four characteristics. One is the notion that the only reality there is the physical universe. There is nothing beyond it. And this physical universe exists by itself, has no creator, it simply is. That's the kind of worldview that we have inherited from the 19th century. I'm interested in the history of ideas, so the 19th century was the climax of this reductionist understanding of reality, that's the physical universe, it's the only reality. And how do you know this physical universe? Through science, empirical science. So the universe is all there is, and only science can lead us to true knowledge. Everything else is fantasy. Remember the late Carl Sagan? Remember his program on television? On the cosmos? He started it by saying, the universe, he said, is all there is. That's a declaration that was similar to what Nietzsche said in the 19th century, God is dead, right? The universe is all there is. And incidentally, this universe is pretty big. I was in a coffee shop with my wife one time, and there comes David Badusky. David Badusky is a colleague in the physics department, an astronomer. And his name was in the Guinness Book of Records for discovering a galaxy, a new galaxy. I said, David, how many galaxies are out there? Well, he said, according to our scientific estimates, the ones that we can identify, at least 100 billion. They're talking about 100 billion galaxies. And these galaxies are made up of billions of stars like our own. This is an awesome kind of breathtaking realization. You know, until the 30s, if I'm not mistaken, we thought that the universe was simply our Milky Way. And since the 60s, I believe, we've come to the conclusion that the Milky Way was one of the 100 billion galaxies like it. And another thing that is so awesome, and I was trying to tell my unbelieving novelist, I said, the universe, these 100 billion galaxies started out of nothing, from a dot, according to the Big Bang theory that most of the astrophysicists accept. So as a philosopher, a contemporary philosopher said, anybody who contemplates the physical universe can only conclude that somebody created it. It could not have come by itself. Or some infinite intelligent reality created this universe. So you cannot be a materialist and contemplate the Big Bang theory of the universe. That's why I'm saying that modern science is an ally to spirituality and religion, not the enemy. And I think the 21st century will be the time when, hopefully and God willing, this reconciliation will take place. So if we live long enough, maybe we can see it. So the universe is all there is, according to this syndrome of modernity that we inherited from the 19th century. We cannot, only science can give us true knowledge of this physical universe. And the other part of the syndrome is that there are no moral standards that transcend our culture and society. Those of you who have studied sociology and anthropology know that this is called cultural relativism. That morality is what society tells you morality is. There are no universal principles of morality. To me, when I encountered that way of thinking, I got goosebumps, because I think, what did Dostoevsky say about this? He said, if God is gone, anything goes. In other words, you reduce the reality to the physical universe, then of course anything goes. So this is a kind of it has nihilistic implication. Forget about what some materialist philosophers are telling you. If there is no God, there is no morality. Because there is no foundation upon which any morality can be built. Otherwise, why would American judges go to Nuremberg and judge the Nazis for crimes against humanity? Today we are talking about universal human rights. They are not part of any particular culture, but human beings today, collectively, we have reached this conclusion that there are some such things as universal human rights. That's why we cannot accept slavery as something that is okay. So, relativism. And the fourth syndrome of modernity is the notion that human beings, we as human beings, are nothing more than our genes and our cultural conditioning. There is no spirit as such. Well, when I started thinking about the kind of education I received, those four principles came to my mind, which I have called the syndrome of modernity. But when I thought deeper about this syndrome, I realized that in fact, this syndrome may be a form of spiritual awakening in disguise, but it is not recognized as such. Now, why am I saying that? Number one, the universe is all there is. Well, this kind of false understanding of reality, in my estimation, helped modern science develop. We paid attention to the physical universe. So we developed physics, we developed chemistry. It is physics, chemistry, astronomy that led us to the understanding of the Big Bang, who bring us to an understanding that there must be something beyond the physical universe. The notion that you cannot accept anything on belief, but you have to really test it scientifically. What does that mean in the final analysis? In the final analysis, it means that we cannot believe blindly, that we need evidence in order to accept anything as true. Why is this important? Or remember Thomas? What did Thomas do? When they told him Jesus was resurrected, what did Thomas say? I have to really experience Jesus before I can accept that he resurrected. So in a way, when Jesus said to Thomas, come and take a look, it's like Jesus telling us, explore me. Try to have a direct experience of myself. In a sense that we are asked as human beings to really come to know God through direct experience. What do the monks on Mount Athos try to do? What did Father Seraphim, what happened to him accidentally? He had a direct experience of Christ, and that transformed him. In other words, it's his belief, or his faith, I should say. I differentiate between faith and belief. Belief is to accept something without, faith is trust. I have faith because I trust that God governs the universe, and therefore there is nothing to fear. That's faith. But belief is, I believe that this thing is real or this thing is not real. So when I looked at that, I said, but we are given the green light to study reality and get to know the Creator through His creation. In reference to the relativism that I mentioned, meaning that we anthropologists exposed us to all these diverse cultures around the world. And this led to this kind of relativistic kind of view of morality. Is there anything good that came out of this? Well, good and bad is always mixed. The bad thing is some people concluded that there is no morality, anything goes. On the other hand, this kind of exposure to diversity made us more understanding as human beings. Compare the United States with some societies who are very isolated and very no contact with anybody other than themselves. Usually you find a lot of xenophobia that can lead to a lot of intolerance. So I believe we are very blessed that we live in a society of this great diversity because we are in a way forced to become tolerant of one another. And if God is love, before we get there, we need to become more understanding. Understanding leads to tolerance. Tolerance leads to love. Love leads to God. This is how I came to re-examine that syndrome of modernity, both in my life and in what I see around me. And in reference to the fourth principle that I mentioned, namely that we as human beings are nothing more than our genes and our cultural conditioning, in a way, it helped us focus on understanding human beings as products of society. I'm a sociologist, and therefore I can appreciate what sociology and anthropology and psychology have to offer about our understanding of human beings. The problem is that we have ignored the biggest part of ourselves, namely the spirit. With a friend of mine, a sociologist, who we think alike, we try to introduce a kind of perspective with our own discipline to bring spirit back into the equation. That when we teach our students about how society and culture conditions us, how our genes impact on our makeup, we also need to keep the door open that over and beyond this, there may be something that is unique to every human being, and that is the spirit within. And there are certain theoretical understanding within this syndrome of modernity that can lead us to this kind of understanding. Now, I am saying all this is a bit abstract, but I'm saying that to tell you how I began to re-examine and liberate myself from this stranglehold of the syndrome of modernity that I absorb by osmosis, and most people are not aware of it. So what I hope with this kind of reflection, we can correct this syndrome of modernity and marry it with a spiritual understanding of the self, of who we are as human beings. Now, why was I able to begin thinking? I don't give myself credit. In what sense? In the sense that had certain extraordinary coincidences or synchronicities not taking place in my life, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. And one of that synchronicity was when I was a graduate student, in fact, at the University of Kentucky for a year. I took a course on social theory, and the professor asked us to choose one major thinker out of a list of 10 or 15 classical sociologists and write about him and present our findings to the class. That was the seminar. Well, I was thinking that I was going to pick up either Marx, Durkheim, Weber, some of the big guns of sociology. The professor said it is first come, first served. So I took my time to look around. By the time I went to the professor, Marx was gone, Durkheim was gone, Weber was gone, Mead was gone. Who is left? I have a couple of here. One is Thorstein Veblen, the other is Pidirin Alexandrovich Sorokin. Who is that guy? Well, he said, these are the only two left. You have to decide. I was so disappointed. So disappointed. I went back to take a look and see who these people were. And the more I read about Sorokin, the more I got fascinated. Who was Sorokin? I attribute that accident as a very important turning point in my life because it opened possibilities for me that I would not have had I not done that research project. In what way? Sorokin was Russian. He was a refugee from the Russian Revolution. Very basic biographical notes is that he was teaching sociology at the University of St. Petersburg. He was a Menshevik. He took part in the revolution against the Tsar, but the Bolsheviks eventually took over, and he went into hiding. He surrendered himself. The Bolsheviks sentenced him to death. They were going to execute him the next day. One of his former students was a Bolshevik, went to Lenin and implored him to spare Sorogin's life. So Sorogin let him go, let him out of jail. So here is this guy who was expecting to be executed the next day, and the next day they let him free. So eventually he came to the United States. He was given a position at the University of Minnesota. For 5 years he made a name for himself as a brilliant sociologist. And Harvard invited him to start the sociology department during the 30s. To make a long story short, Sorogin came from a different world. His father was an icon gilder. He was taking care of icons in church. And as a boy, he was moving from village to village, taking care of icons. And the father, there were some problems with the father. He was drunk, and anyway, the two boys left the house, and they started making a living, taking care of icons. Sorogin never went to school. He went straight to the university. He passed the examination. He was self-taught. And in other words, he was a genius. Well, when Sorogin came to Harvard, he developed a magnificent study called social and cultural dynamics. And that's what I was reading to find out who he was. And there I was introduced to some concept that went contrary to this syndrome of modernity that I just mentioned. What was it? At that time, during the 30s, everybody was talking, when I say everybody, most of the leading thinkers assumed that religion was a thing of the past, that it's a leftover of medievalism, and that with time, religion will disappear. Full secularism would take over, and full rationality, in other words. That was the dominant conclusion of most sociologists, or most psychologists, all the leading thinkers of the time. Sorogin, based on his very detailed study of history, empirical study of history, concluded that religion is going to return, that what we are moving towards, he said, is towards an age of faith. Now, nobody took him seriously when he made those statements. He was writing during the rise of Hitler and Stalinism in Russia. He was writing during the Second World War. And with all that mayhem, he was talking about the coming spirituality, the coming revival of religion. So that was very fascinating, and his theory was very convincing, to me at least. Had he lived today, you know what he would have said, and he was not a humble man. He would say, I told you so. And you are not listening. So I was very intrigued. At the same time, I appreciated his struggle to adapt to American society. Why did I appreciate it? Because I went through similar kind of struggles to adapt to American society. And being an Orthodox Russian, I had that kind of cultural connection with Sorogin. But the thing that really was also mostly fascinating to me was how he defined personality. He said, the self, he said, is not only made of the conscious mind and the subconscious, as Freud taught. The self, he said, has also what he called a supra-conscious. This is the source of real creativity, the source of real intuition. So Sorogin was trying to tell us that there is more to human beings than this physical body. And then I read somewhere in his work that certain phenomena, such as calculating boys, somebody like Rain Man, have you seen that film? Mm-hmm. Well, these are real phenomena. That here is this individual who is mentally handicapped. He cannot even feed himself, and all of a sudden his mind is like a calculator. Where did he get this ability. I remember watching a film one time, on 60 Minutes, if I remember correctly, of a couple of elderly people who adopted an 18-year-old boy who had the mind of a 2-year-old. And he couldn't feed himself, he could hardly walk. They did it because they were compassionate and they thought that was their spiritual work, to help this boy have a good life. So they bought a piano. And they were just playing with him. One night, they went to bed, and they heard a piano concerto playing downstairs. The husband asked the wife, "Did you forget the television on?" And he said, "No, I didn't forget the television on." So they go downstairs, and they find an 18-year-old to play that magnificent Beethoven sonata. They fell on the ground crying because they considered it a miracle. And the cameraman now asked the boy to play that again on camera. He played. And then he said, "How did you learn this?" And he could hardly speak. He said, "Louvre. In other words, love taught me how to play." Well, Sorokin claimed that we have this third source of knowledge he called intuition, and that in our culture we have cultivated only knowledge that comes from our senses, knowledge that comes through our mind, but we have not cultivated knowledge that comes through intuition. Here is a hunch. I think Sorokin must have met some of the starts of Russia. And these people, like Saint Seraphim of Sarov, were well known in Russia. And don't forget that both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky frequented the monastery of Optina. And their writing was influenced by their contact with some of the elders or the starets there. So his conclusion of intuition, that there is such a thing as intuition, was fascinating to me. In retrospect, this Sorokin also wrote an article. He was president of the American Sociological Association for a year. And in that address, he advocated for the development of integralist truth. Integralist truth meaning a kind of truth that combines knowledge of the mind, namely philosophy, knowledge of the senses, namely empirical science, and knowledge that comes from intuition. And by intuition, he didn't mean you have a hunch and then you go for science to test it. But it is a bona fide source of knowledge independent of the other two. So later on, when I encountered the work of Mount Athos and so on, I would see some of these elders like Paisios and Porphyrios and being masters of intuitive knowledge in the sense that they had abilities that could not be explained through the syndrome of modernity. Right? So during the, let's put it this way, when you are old enough, you can divide your life in terms of decades. So let me divide my life in terms of decades and tell you what happened to me during these decades. During the 60s, I became an agnostic. I ended up in Maine as an agnostic, and there I began becoming skeptical of my own skepticism. That's one of the problems of these contemporary die-hard skeptics. They are skeptical about everything else except their own skepticism. So I was beginning to get interested in the kind of stuff that Sorokin was talking about in reference to intuition. One day I was walking outside of in the corridor of our department. That was during the first semester that I was appointed there. And outside the door of one of my colleagues who just came in, and also he was a product of the 60s, and I saw a sign outside of his door. And it said, "Please do not disturb. Meditation in process." What is this? I said. outside of the sociologist or meditation in process. I go to the secretary and I said, what is Steve doing there? He said, he is meditating. So I got curious. Steve explained to me what he was doing. He said he was doing transcendental meditation. He learned from Maharishi Yogi how to meditate. And he said, this is very good. It lowers your metabolism, it helps you with your health, and you can revitalize your energy, you can work harder. You mean I can work harder and write articles so I can get tenure? He said, of course. Being an assistant professor at the time, well, naturally we are full of anxiety. Are we going to get tenure or not? And to get tenure, you have to publish. So I said, I'll meditate. Well, it worked. Well, but with that kind of meditation that has become almost like a household word now in the United States, they introduced it to jades and so on. And you know who brought TM to America? It was Maharishi Yogi, the Beatles brought him here during the 60s. Well, I am a member of the 60s, but I never inhaled. Not consciously anyway. I tell you not mentioning this. I mentioned that in my interview. Here is one of those coincidences that changed my life. When I was working on my dissertation, I had a lot of good material for my dissertation, but I didn't have a theoretical framework to integrate that material. And I was working and I was working and nothing worked. So I was very frustrated. I thought I would never finish. I would never get my doctoral degree. And very disappointed and heartbroken, I went in the middle of campus. It was July, starry night. I sat on a bench and I was watching the stars. And then a hippie came and sat next to me. So he started smoking, and I was inhaling the fumes. And we started talking about the galaxies, the stars out there, the universe. And all of a sudden, it was as if I was struck by lightning. I said, oh my God, I got it. We were talking about the galaxies, and then I found the theoretical framework for my dissertation. It was as if it was a revelation. It was an intuition. I couldn't wait until the next morning to find my advisor and tell him about it. So at that night, I felt like screaming around campus, saying, you read it? So the next morning, I found my advisor. I explained to him what was on my mind. I didn't explain to him how I ended up. And he approved it, and that's how I got my doctoral degree. So Sorokin was right, intuition. Anyway, so I was beginning to realize that my profession during the 60s didn't tell me the whole story about the nature of reality. And I was uncomfortable. You see, after I got my job at the University of Maine, I said to myself, now what? So I got a doctoral degree, I got a job. Sooner or later I'm going to grow old and die. And then what? Why bother? So I had this kind of inner agony that somehow death creates a kind of a dead end for every one of us. And it was this thing that I began to re-examine my earlier kind of work. And I thought of Sorokin. Then I started reading about scientists who were claiming that the world is not as it appears to be. They were trying to bring spirit somewhere from the back door. And I got fascinated. I read the Tao of Physics, for example. I was exposed to Buddhism and Hinduism. And I have great respect for this religion, but I'm not a Buddhist or a Hindu. And I am delighted to find that there are some similarities in some of the teachings that we have. And I tell sometimes people, no, we don't have to demonize other religions to be grounded in our own. I feel great happiness when I see, for example, that the Taoists came to the same conclusion as some of the early fathers of the church, that Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. Well, what did the Markides of Pondus say? The God that can be named is not the real God. We have great differences between these other people, but in my own experience, had I not been exposed to these other religions, and this is unique to me, I would not have taken Orthodoxy seriously. What happened to me? During the 80s, I was re-examining my cultural conditioning in the 60s, and I was about to have my first sabbatical. And at that time, I was interested in international terrorism. My training was in political sociology. I had an article that was already accepted by a leading journal on terrorism. It was revised and resubmitted. In other words, they asked me to do some revisions and then submitted. Probably would have been published. I'm glad I didn't publish it because it would have taken me to a different direction. I didn't publish it, I didn't bother with it, because when I went to Cyprus and I was getting ready to write a book on international terrorism, I was walking down in Nicosia and I met an old friend. And that friend of mine that I hadn't seen for about 10 years, we were excited to meet one another. She invited us to her home. Her husband was a judge in the Supreme Court there. She was the head of a high school. And we started talking in the evening about various things. Then we started discussing philosophy. She was a philologist. She studied in Athens. But at the same time, I was very impressed with the kind of things that she was talking about, the nature of reality. I said, who taught you all these things? He said, I have a teacher. And who is your teacher? Daskalos. Somebody who lived 2 miles away from my house, and I'd never met. I was told that he was psychic, he has all kinds of abilities as I was growing up, and I was told to stay away from him. Well, I got curious. Here I was, it took me 18 years away from Cyprus to meet someone who lived 2 miles away from my house. Now, had I not met this friend of mine accidentally, she would not have introduced me to him. And I would not have spent 10 years studying that guy, because I was so fascinated. I put the terrorism project in the back burner, and I said, my God, this requires anthropological investigation. Because here is this high school graduate who didn't have much exposure to the world. And he spoke like a philosopher. How did he know all that? Furthermore, he had certain intuitive abilities. Sorokin came to my mind. Here is an example. So, all of my relatives, including my wife, he said, what are you doing? You are wasting your time. You are wasting your career away. I said, this needs a study. I must study this guy. Because I had read a lot about tribal shamans and medicine men and healers. And I said, this guy is a Christian healer. And he was also a secret friend of the Archbishop, but that's another story. He considered himself a Christian. He was talking about Jesus as the Logos and so on. But he had some peculiar ideas that generated all kinds of problems for him. And for me later on after I wrote books about him. But anyway, what I noticed about him is that he had those kinds of intuitive knowledge that Sorokin talked about as having their grounding in the superconscious. The man's mind worked like a radio station or a television station. He could see things and say things that nobody could have known. Identifying the physical condition of a woman that lived in New York by just rubbing her picture with closed eyes. Something that really stunned me, it happened in front of my eyes. A woman called me, the husband called me from New York. We have this problem with my wife, the doctors cannot identify what the problem is. Do you mind taking a picture to this healer inside that you wrote about? I said, I'll be happy to. I take the picture, I went there, the son, I give it to him, closes his eyes. He said, the problem of this woman is having her teeth full of infection. She should take the teeth and the problem will go away. It's a dental issue. You want me to write to this woman to go and heal her? Was I tell me? Well, I did. And when I came back, I wrote the letter apologetically. Anyway, the guy, he called me up a month later after I came back. And he said, you remember that case? He said, I do remember. And he said, when we got your letter, we threw it away. I thought it was nonsense. I said, I don't blame you. He said, no, I did not understand. My wife's teeth exploded at the front, and then infectious mucus was dripping from the holes. So they went to the dentist, took care of the teeth, and their symptoms went away. I have seen cases, one after another, like this, how he identified the condition of the German ambassador. I took him there. A colleague of mine from the University from Yale University that I was working with him to bring peace between the Greeks and the Turks. He was concerned about my reputation that I was spending with this guy. Anyway, he eventually I took him there, and he told me, Professor, you should stop drinking because you have an infection on your liver without an examination. Anyway, he said, what is he talking about? I said, I don't know. Then later on, he called me from New Heaven and said, remember what your healer told me? I said, yes, I have to tape. And he said, well, I went to the doctors, they took an examination, and they realized that I have an infection on the liver exactly as the healer was telling me. But the doctor said it was impossible for anybody to identify the virus. It takes 3 months to incubate, but there are no instruments. Next year, Bernard was by the cycles asking questions. They did tell him that it was not a fatal disease, but not to be good. Now, why I don't want to spend time talking about that, but what I wanted to say, that was a stage in my life, in the sense that I empirically realized that we are not what we appear to be, that we are more than our physical senses. And again, I thought of Sorokin's notion of intuition. Guess what? I have discovered in my own experience that a lot of people have such experiences, but they don't talk about them because they are afraid of being stigmatized, either as mentally ill or that they somehow are possessed by demons or whatever. So there is some kind of a paraculture out there of people who have extraordinary experiences, just like the guy that I mentioned who saw Paisios in front of him. You go and tell that to a psychiatrist, and they give you Prozac. In fact, a lot of people that could end up in mental asylums, and the former Soviet psychiatrists did a lot of work stigmatizing dissidents as mental illness and mental asylums, so they silenced them. Well, I know people even who have university positions, and they come and tell me their inner life, not in the form of a confession, but in the form of, I am glad I met somebody who is willing to hear what I'm experiencing without stigmatizing me. So because of these books, I am safe, and people come. So I discovered that there are people who have these unusual abilities. Now, obviously, within Orthodoxy, we have that, but it comes at the stage of photisis. After the catharsis, then photisis, then theosis. Because if those abilities come at the time when you are spiritually immature, they can be used for the wrong purposes. That's why in Orthodoxy, there is such a strong emphasis on work on the catharsis stage first, and then these others are coming as natural gifts of the Spirit. Well, after my exposure, somehow during the 80s, my tenure with these healers ended. First of all, Lascaros died, others. I faded away from that group. That was just at the time when a friend of mine who knew of my involvement said to me, why don't you come to Mount Athos and I will introduce you to real saints. Oh, I said, Mount Athos, what can Mount Athos have that I would be interested? Somehow I developed new prejudices at the time because I thought that if you want authentic spirituality, you have to find it outside of the church. That was the wrong conclusion that I do. That's why my friend said to me, come to Mount Athos and I'll introduce you to real saints. Incidentally, people today, they say, I'm spiritual but not religious. And then they get together without people who are spiritual and they appoint a secretary, a president, and a treasurer, and so on. But yet they're against all kinds of religion. Well, that I mentioned at the beginning that it was my wife who said to me, why don't you go to Mount Athos? So I had another sabbatical. I went to Mount Athos, thanks to this friend of mine. And guess what? The first monk that I met outside of the Batoberi Monastery was Father Maximus. He was a young monk at the time. He was 31 or 32 years old. And it was almost an immediate attraction. Have you ever met people that you meet for 5 minutes and you become lifelong friends? And sometimes you may have a colleague who is next to your office, and for a lifetime, for 30 years plus, you say, good morning, how are you? And that's as far as your conversation goes. I have very close, intimate colleagues, some of them retired. But I also have examples like this. But with Father Maximus, it was an immediate connection. So we became friends. And we walked on the mountains, and we talked about things. It was during Holy Week. And I was very impressed with his knowledge. And I remember he told me, you know, real communism is right here in these monasteries. The communists try to bring the good society through violence. It is only through the love of Christ that we can have the good society. So it was very interesting. And then as we were walking, he said, are you going to have communion on Sunday? I said, well, Father, I came to know that was why everybody's going to have communion. Have you gone for confession? He said, confession, Father? I said, I haven't gone to confession since I was 12 years old. And he said, what? He said, don't you think it's time? Well, I said, no, he's 18 years younger than I am. So he was 31, I was 18 years older. I said, Father, we'll see. He said, on Friday evening, I will be in the chapel next to the church, and I will be seeing people for confession. Why don't you come? We'll just have a chat. I said to him, well, Father, we'll see. Of course, we'll see meant no. So I was in church, and even if you are growing up in Cyprus, in the Greek Orthodox tradition, I was an altar boy, I was going through confessions and so on. And then America corrupted me during the 60s. So anyway, and when I found myself in the church, I felt very comfortable because it was familiar ground for me. And I was very enchanted with the beautiful chants on Holy Friday. So, and then at a certain point, as I was being mesmerized by the beautiful chants and the incense burning and the incredible beauty of the church inside, I felt somebody pulling me by the hand. He said, come, he said, your time has come. I looked, it was Father Maximus. He said, come. I said to myself, oh my God. I look up and I see the face of Jesus. And how can you say no to Jesus? And then my academic mind, I had to find justification. And then I said, look, You are a participant observer. You study things. He's not asking you to smoke mushrooms. He's asking you to have a conversation with him. I'm talking about some of the anthropologists in the Amazon. That was the way I was thinking of it. So I go into the confessional. And he was sitting on one chair. He said, sit down here. I sat down. He had his stole on. He looked down. He said, go ahead. I said, go ahead where? And he said, anything about your life. As a confession. So I started telling him about my life. It took an hour of a monologue, telling him all the things that I have experienced and I've done, things that I was proud about, the things that I was ashamed about. He was listening. It was like a life review, just like when you have a near-death experience and then there is this live review. I had it talking to him in that encounter. But that encounter really brought us close together. And he remained my confessor ever since. So I go there once a year, I see him, I tell him all the bad things I've done. And then, after the confessional, I said to him, and he gave me I thought maybe he would tell me for 2 years you do not have communion. And he said, you can go and have communion. Thank you, Father. I said to him, do you know somebody by the name of Paisios? And he said, well, he smiled. He said, he's one of my elders. Can I meet him? He said, sure, but it has to be after Easter. Fine, on Monday. Very good. But it's a long walk. It's a 4 hours walk. I said, I don't mind. I was told from the priest of Bangor that if you go to Mount Athos, try to see if you can meet Elder Paisios. But he said it's very difficult because he's a hermit. It's not good, but ask. So there it was. I had a chance to meet this legendary elder. As we were walking there, he was telling us all kinds of stories about Elder Paisios that I wrote about in the Mountain of Silence and elsewhere. About his extraordinary intuitive abilities. Again, going back to sorority. So after my experience, after sorority, my experiences with this healer, I was ready to listen to miracles, like the miracles that Elder Paisios carried out. Like the man who came and told him that his wife was dying from cancer, and he said, go back and your wife is okay. And he goes back and his wife is okay. And the wife couldn't understand what was happening to her because she felt at a certain point that her cancer was being washed away. And it was a time when Elder Paisios told him, go and your wife is okay. And many other stories like that. So Father Maximus, as we were walking there, he said to me, ask him any questions you want, but don't ask him questions about his healing abilities or whatever. So I said, I promise, Father, don't worry. So my turn came to have a one-to-one encounter with Elder Paisios. You know, it was the first time that I encountered a real saint. Just when I saw him, it was like the saint that came out of the icons. But with one difference. This saint has a fantastic sense of humor. He was cracking one joke after another. And so much so that I said, my God, he's so much better than Johnny Carson. So, when my time came, I came there. I stopped, I didn't know what to say. I already had went through confession, so I didn't have anything to confess. And I told him that. I said, and Father, how do you do those healings? It was as if the devil got inside me and asked me that question. And he stiffened up. My son, he said, I don't do any healing. It's the Holy Spirit that does the healing. And he refused to take any credit, of course. And then I found out from Father Maximus that he spent all his time praying for different categories of people. For widows, for orphans, for people who are in accidents. And he told Father Maximus one time, people come and tell me that they have seen me here and there, but I've been here all the time, he said. But I have as I pray, I have a vision that I am there doing certain things. But in reality, he said, it's the Holy Spirit that takes my image and does those things, not myself. That was very interesting. So anyway, I heard all kinds of extraordinary phenomena that are attributed to Elder Paisios. And he himself would say that Elder Porphyrios is, he said, if people think I am black and white, Elder Porphyrios is like color TV. I've never met Elder Paisios. I wish I'd done Porphyrios before he died. He spent all his life as a priest at the Monastery Square in downtown Athens. And before he died, he went to Mount Athos, and that's where he's buried. Incidentally, if you want to visit Elder Paisios' burial ground, it's not on Mount Athos. He scandalized the monks because he requested that he be buried in the women's monastery outside of Mount Athos. And many of the monks felt offended that somehow. So I went to his grave people having some kind of. Another thing that he made, part of his will, is not to get his bones and make them talismans. Leave his bones on the ground, because he was so humble, he didn't want to be considered a saint. Well, I've told you many, many stories, and I would like to leave, if we have time, for some questions.
20 minutes.
How many?
20 minutes.
We have 20 minutes for questions?
Correct.
Oh, great. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. I love what you said about how the syndrome of modernity might have a spiritual awakening buried in there somewhere. It's kind of funny to call this a question because it's going to take a while to get to the question part. But if you look at the four most important people in terms of the development of modernity, I would say they're Archimedes, Galileo, Newton, and Einstein.
Okay.
Archimedes was the first human being to use mathematical models of abstract things to solve practical problems. And we all know many of those solutions he has. So millions of people in the third world still get their water by a hand pump that's almost exactly what he designed 2,500 years ago. Obviously, with Galileo, you had this conflict between science and the church. I think much of the foundation for this lie that we call cultural relativism, where a cultural relativist says, well, you know, the Christian has their point of view, the Muslim has theirs, we're all relative, therefore none of them are true. The fundamental basis for that is ignorance of mathematics.
Very good.
If I asked people in this room, what do you think of when you think of Einstein, how many would raise their hand if I said E equals mc squared? When you think mathematically of Einstein, E equals mc squared. Okay, several people know it. Who knows the Einstein's relativistic correction factor? Anyone? Okay. It's more important than E equals mc squared. Einstein said, you've got one frame of reference here, one frame of reference here, and he wrote a fraction, a mathematical formula that says, here's how you take what Newton would say is going on here, classically, and correct it, adjust it, any measurement for what's going on in this other frame of reference that's moving. That's elegant. That's saying there is a translation. As you were saying, I can see as a Christian thinker the truth in what a Buddhist is saying. That's your sort of correction factor. So those people, the cultural relativists who say there is no truth, that's ignorance.
Yes,
Pure
I
ignorance.
couldn't agree
No
with you more.
justification.
Yes, that's why I believe that science is going to be a tool for the researchers of religion and spirituality in the 21st century. That's my, and I see it happening in the university. I can speak about issues like this without being reluctant, because there are more people who are thinking along these lines. So, yes, thank you very much. You must know mathematics.
So you find that what Christ said, certainly you shall find, has benefited you in your search?
Yes, yes.
Can you repeat the question?
the question.
Or the question was, as Christ said, search and you shall
Search
find.
and you shall find.
And a lot, through the ages, people were reluctant really to search because they thought
It's my belief, my strong belief, that science is a spiritual tool for the discovery of truth with capital T. And again, I started thinking like that very reluctantly ever since I studied sorority. That's why these encounters are in my life, were so decisive. Yes. And furthermore, if you look at other human beings and we practice the notion that every human being has the Christ within, then Christ is not there inside these people. So if they are ready to accept it, I was asked once, as I wrote in Gifts of the Desert, about how do you explain this notion that only through me you can find the Father? Only through Christ. I said, look, we can explain it in two ways. One is that everybody has to be Orthodox Christian before they can reach heaven, which is, practically speaking, it's not a very appealing notion because the majority of people in the world are not Orthodox Christians. I personally believe that in Orthodox Christianity we have the fullest expression of the Logos. And I don't need to demonize others who may not have that, or if they do have it, I don't know about it. I leave that to God. But I do, when I look at other human beings and having the Christ within, then I can only see them with love and compassion. There is no other way. And I think Jesus' example with the Good Samaritan is really giving us this kind of teaching. So, all knowledge comes from God. And science is a gift from God. And therefore, science had to discover its spiritual roots. And I don't think Galileo was a materialist. He was not. None of these great scientists were materialists. Now, it is possible that some scientists who believed in God had a different notion of God than what we understand. And I think that's where Orthodoxy can come to contribute a corrective. In other words, Spinoza and even Einstein may have posited a God because they couldn't explain the universe otherwise. But they thought that God created the universe and left it to work on its own. So even Newton was a believer, but their notion of God was, here is this clock maker who created this clock and left it to work on its own. In our understanding of God, yes, God is wholly outside of the universe, but as Gregory Balamas so beautifully put it, God is embedded in every particle of his creation. And therefore, there is nothing outside of God, but this is not pantheism. And here is a new term that came recently as a result of this understanding. There is theism, atheism, agnosticism, monotheism, polytheism, pantheism, which is a belief that everything is God. Matter is God, in other words. But panentheism is a new terminology to account for this understanding that God is totally outside of his creation, but embedded in every particle of his creation through his energies. So that means that we can have an experiential knowledge of God through God's energies, not to the essence which is beyond any human understanding. This is high philosophy theology. But it is simple, really. Not a Christian, some Buddhist, I think, or some Hindu, they ask him, what is God? And he shocked everybody. He said, a piece of excrement. By that he meant, he wanted to give them a lesson, that there is nothing in this created universe that it is not sacred. Well, I think the Paramanian understanding that the Orthodox Church accepted is based on this pantheistic understanding of God. Correct me if I'm mistaken, Father. See, one has to keep an open mind, not too open to the point where the brains will spill out. All right.
I would like to, if you could elaborate on if you've seen in the academic community, are there more Christian academics? Is Christianity getting sort of any reconsideration or second hearing?
Christianity has a very bad press in the university setting. Part of it is because of the bad, the cultural baggage that comes through the centuries, through the Inquisition, through the fundamentalist kind of Christianity, Protestant fundamentalism that is it's defined as rigid, intolerant, and xenophobic. I'm giving a talk at the university next Friday. The peace program is setting it up. I have colleagues who think along these lines, and they want me to talk, and I will address this issue about academia and Christianity. I think that if Christianity is understood as I have experienced it with the elders and with Dr. Paisios Porphyrios, people don't have to go to the Far East to bring Hindus and Buddhists, because Christianity is more compatible with the Western cultural tradition. So my position is that, you know something, we have the same thing in Buddhism and more. And therefore, that's the way I try to bring Christianity to the academic setting. But there are individuals who are Christians and they go to church, but you won't find there are more courses on Hinduism, Buddhism, Native American religion, shamanism, than there is about Christianity. Because Christianity is, again, because of our current political polarization, Christianity is defined as a kind of a reactionary Protestant product. And that's why Orthodoxy, I think, can play a role in reconsidering. I gave a talk in Montreal, and a black woman, and a well-known author, asked me a question about the Inquisition. And I said to her, my dear, there was no Inquisition in the Eastern Church. And she was very surprised. So it's a matter of information. And with time, hopefully, we all have a responsibility to bring this in a way that will be digestible and acceptable to the rest of the world. And I think we have that capacity. What we must be careful is not to imitate the Protestant fundamentalists, because we will be labeled as another of those, and therefore we will alienate people rather than inviting. The best way to, on Easter Day, I had the blessing, both me and my wife, to baptize two artists. The woman is John, and the husband is the woman is Joan, and the husband is John. So I will be the godfather of the husband, and my wife will be the godmother of the wife. And they decided to become Orthodox. I don't want to praise myself, because it's Father Maximus, after reading The Mountain of Silence, and in these books. Because they didn't know that there was such a Christianity. Yes.
Yes, I thank you for the comments. They used to call me the raging Protestant before I became Orthodox. But one of the things, I don't know if I definitely agree with you about science becoming more open to the concept of God. However, I'm wondering if there's a double like of polarization, because Stephen Hawking was recently asked about, where does God fit in all of science? And flat said on public TV, and it was actually on the Discovery Channel, simultaneous broadcast, he said that there is no God, and that everything created itself, and that even we may have created these ideas, but that there is no God. And I was absolutely appalled, because here is all this creation and everything being, expanding and being new stars developing and so forth and so on. And where is, how could someone even ask or to say such a thing? I don't understand it, why people come out with that.
Well, I think Stephen Hawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens and others are my understanding, the last gasps of materialism that is fading away. And I think his understanding, he may be a Nobel laureate of biology, but his understanding of theology and philosophy is that of a very clever sophomore at the university who thinks he knows everything.
Yeah.
In fact, he's ignorant. And he does not impress me one bit, because he's just, the guy is dismissed. And in fact, he played an important role, because he generated responses to his work, and a lot of good stuff has come out in the form of books. So he's playing an important role as a catalyst to bring out true theology and true wisdom. Good luck to Stephen Hawking. I think they are, here is what happened to people like you. It's as if they got all their education in the late 19th century. They fell asleep during the 20th century, and they just woke up. And they are mouthing slogans of the 19th century. So once we understand these things, we don't let these people spoil our day.
One more question here.
Yes.
As a sociologist, where do you attribute that increase of Islam that we see in this country and of course in Europe?
Yeah.
Is there a message that we as Christians don't promote, and they have a different, better message than we do? Because there's a tremendous increase, especially in the prison system, there is big increase in this country of Islam.
Yeah. Well, this problem originated in the 7th century, and we see a phase of it. We need to approach the issue with the Christian way, not the Crusader way. So it's tough. The problems in the Middle East that generated this clash of civilizations, that they are called, this is what is feeding it. It's a mixture of politics, primarily, and leftovers of colonialism and neo-imperialism or whatever. When the Soviet Union collapsed, and after the Muslims of the Middle East realized that those secular ideologies are not going to bring them justice in terms of what they consider justice in the Middle East, somehow Islam was a superior ideology to identify with, and these are the consequences of that. So it's a combination of factors, both political, historical, and theological. Now, the people within Islam that I hope they can play a role in redefining Islam in such a way that will be away from the way Bin Laden and his group define Islam, namely jihad, meaning warfare. There are two types of jihad. Did you know that? The greater jihad and the lesser jihad. The greater jihad is really to work with your passions. You hear some Sufis, for example, who represent that greater jihad, and you feel as if you are listening to a monk from mountains. In fact, Sufism, here is something that you may investigate. Sufism, which is suppressed everywhere in Islam today, they got their understanding of religion from the hermits and the Christian monks of the Middle East as Islam took over. And they lived within the umbrella of Islam, but their theology was very similar to the monastic. In fact, the minaret, there is a strong suspicion that the minaret came from where?
Stylings.
From the Stylites, yeah. They saw the holy man sitting on the top of the columns, and they thought that the higher you are, closer to God, and that's how the minaret was developed. And the mosque was an imitation of Saint Sophia, and then they included the. So the Abrahamic religions have had very bad blood over the centuries, meaning Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So, as we have made peace between Christianity and Judaism, maybe we can make peace between Christianity and Islam. And hopefully, we will see Islamic leaders who will redefine Islam so that we do not have wars all the time. Remember, Islam came as a warrior religion on the Arabian Peninsula, and in 100 years they almost took over Europe. If it wasn't for Byzantium, Europe would have been taken over by Muslim warriors. And also the defeat in the 8th century at the Battle of Tours in France, I believe. So it is not an easy, your question requires a lot of reflection and a lot of dialogue between Christians and Muslims. We cannot allow the more extreme kind of polarization to take place, because with nuclear weapons and this kind of ideologies, we can really create serious problems for the earth.
Thank you very much.
Well,